One of the things I should say is I teach in a management school, but my academic background, I have degrees in economics, history, and I dabbled in philosophy when I worked as a pension fund manager. I was bored during the day, so at night took a study at philosophy at University of Edinburgh, and I did a bit of psychology as well. So my background isn't a conventional historian, nor is it a conventional economist. It's a mix, as we'll see as it goes on. And what I'm going to try and do in this paper, which annoys some of the Delorean community, is engage in a bit of archival myth busting. Because I think once you actually look in the archive, rather than listen to things people say in pubs, you will see that the story of Delorean is not easily as cinematic as is often told. Because I'm an economist, I look for things like rationality. And rationality doesn't mean good things. Rationality means people pursuing their rational choice. Rather, that rational choice could be good or bad. And people pursue incentives, risk and reward. And one of the original names of economics, of course, before it was called economics, was political economy. So there's a lot of politics in this story. So I'm very much at the quote-unquote soft end of economics. Some of my economic colleagues think I'm not hardcore enough, but I have a more hardcore version of this paper that suitably impressed them, because I get to talk about Kornoy-Mashkin theorem and things like that. They think, oh, he's a scientist, he's one of us. And then I do a softer version, and the historians go, oh, he's one of us. I hope to be both. I hope to show you that there's advantages to use economics and history. Anyway, so that's enough of the preamble. I don't want to waste all 40 minutes for a preamble, because you'd give me really nasty marks on your little evaluation form. So all 40 minutes of preamble and no stuff. Anyway, so we'll start with a wee cartoon. We'll start with a cartoon, lesson you learn from teaching, number 1. So we have a grey-bearded gentleman and a student. And the grey-bearded gentleman, for those who can't see, at the back. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, yet those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everybody else repeats it. And that is the case that we should in life learn more from failure than success. But people are often very reluctant to confront the sources of failure and instead play this infantile game of apportioning blame. That's not what this paper is about. This paper is about trying to understand success and failure and using economics to interpret the archive. So I have, as always the case nowadays, when I speak in a management school, you have to have executive summaries. So you have to impress everybody that they're executives and they're really busy. So what you have to do is do a summary of what you're going to say before you're going to say it, and then say what you said at the end. So there's going to be 8 points. For this audience, obviously, what's going to be key later on this presentation is what I'm going to call the Columbo moment. You know from the TV show Columbo, Columbo would say, and one more thing. Archival research is a question of trial and error. I've learnt a lot over the years. I've been researching in this archive since 1997. And sometimes archive files you get, you think, that's going to be great, it's going to be full of stuff, and you end up with nothing. Sometimes you find a file and you think, oh well, that could be okay, and actually turns out to be gold dust. So that's just the question of archives. They're hit and miss. But sometimes you end up with a little clue that something is amiss, or something smells funny. And being able to make the links between the historical archive and economics as I do, there's one little bit in the story I'll show you later on, but we'll get to that. So the first thing to say is I'll talk a little bit about economic history and business history at the start, in general, and Delorean in particular. The second thing I should say in this presentation is I'm an economist, economic historian, business historian, so my focus is on trying to understand the business model, okay, and the successes or failures of the business model. I'm not going to, in this paper, talk about memory of the firm, employment relations type stories, important as they are, and nor am I going to talk about the technical issues, simply because I don't have that expertise. And I want to try and convince you that there are stories about incentives and contracts at the heart of understanding Delorean. The third point is that if we take Hollywood 2Ls, what I'll call sort of screenplay versions of the firm's failure, while they provide nice stories that people can tell in the pub, people can write on internet forums and say this is why it failed, it was all blah blah blah's fault. The problem is when you actually look at the archival evidence, they run into problems, and when you get a bit of economics put into it, they run into even more problems. So what you need as an explanation of the failure is you need something that both archivally you have evidence of, and secondly, an interpretation that is consistent with economics. If you don't have those two things, you don't have an explanation. You have something that may be quite entertaining, but isn't an explanation. And we should try and be scientific. So there are going to be two main archival lessons I'm going to argue. The first is that if we're going to look in the archive to understand what happened, we have to look much earlier than is often the case. People think because Delorean started in 78, that that's when you should start looking in the archive. That's a mistake. So what's happening in the archive from 71 onwards, and through actually the period 71-76, is actually vital to understanding what went wrong. Because if we don't understand that period, we certainly won't understand why Delorean came, and we won't understand, secondly, why the flaws in the business model existed. So it's vital that you start the archival search earlier. Okay? Just because something happened in 78 doesn't mean the relevant archives start in 78. Okay, so I runs back. So the second lesson, the first paper I wrote about Delorean in was an economics paper about counter-terrorism. And in that paper, I had not looked as widely or deeply in the archives as I have now. And I kind of took for granted Roy Mason's account in his autobiography. And what has become quite clear to me is the more archivally I look, that his account is at odds with the archival evidence. Because what's clear to me is if we're telling the story is far more about civil service infighting and a poorly drafted contract that we're going to talk about later on, than it is about a conspiracy. I'm going to, last night at the electric Delorean launch, there was one individual who believed in a massive conspiracy and thought I was an FBI stooge. I'm not an FBI stooge. Hello YouTube again. Just to confirm I'm not. Anyway, at least if I was, I wouldn't admit, would I? But anyway, the point was that was alleged. I don't see any evidence for these conspiracy theories, and we'll see actually individuals act in exactly the reverse as one would have expected, as some of these conspiracy theories suggest. Okay. The next point is, there are many achievements of Delorean. I'll talk about 4. But, and here's the but, the many good things it did were done at an incredibly high cost per job. If you wanted to create jobs in West Belfast on Murray in 1978, you could have created far more jobs for the money that was spent in Delorean. Okay, so in a pure, naked accounting sense, if I was purely giving you an accounting paper, I would say it was poor value for money on that basis. But I'm not. Because it wasn't simply about creating jobs. It was about creating jobs, but it wasn't simply. It was about Northern Ireland's image in the world, and it was about attracting further investment. And the other things that would have led to employment creation at less cost would not have had those advantages. Okay, so in economics we always think about maximising subject to your constraints, rationality. So in other words, there was a rationality to the decision that was made to bring Delorean in. We're going to see the implementation was suspect. Okay. The next point may be a bit more controversial. The archival evidence, I think, is consistent with interpreting, with an interpretation that suggests that it was legal issues and political image issues that kept money going in rather than commerce or commercial considerations. And last, and certainly not least, The closure, I think, was a combination of Delorean miscalculating and the Treasury finally getting its way. So, for all this talk about Mavericks and Thatcher and Reagan and all that you read in some of the literature, I don't buy that story because it just hasn't got the evidence. So, just before I talk specifically about Delorean, I just want to make a methodological point. I said earlier on, I'm an economic historian. Okay, Chris Colvin, my colleague, spoke a couple of weeks ago in this series. And he's, like myself, a member of the Queen's Centre for Economic History. We're one of the biggest concentrations in Europe. We're the biggest in the UK, outside of the London School of Economics. And in the Tilburg rankings, we're one of the top 10 in the world. So it's something that Queen's does well, and we keep quiet about it in a very Northern Irish kind of way. But I think we should sometimes publicise the fact that Queen's does some things quite well, despite my best efforts, perhaps. But anyway, economic history, just to remind you, is the attempt to fuse economics and history. So when you try and fuse two disciplines, you want to take the best from both. Of course, the danger is you take the worst from both, but you're trying to avoid that. Why do I say fuse economics and history? Because economists and economics and history both have great advantages, but they have both great disadvantages, and one can offset the other. So economists are brilliant at talking about causality. If I ask an economist to explain why the demand for Delorean is lower than expected, it's very easy to give a causal story based upon the price. That's a wonderful story. But if I ask an economist to explain about contingency, about something that might have been different, or it depends, economists are generally not very good at that. In contrast, historians are brilliant at contingency. They're brilliant at it depends stories. That's what historians do. But historians are very poor at talking about causal relationships. You ask historians about causal relationships, and you get on so on and so forth at a bit of a muddle. So what we need to do is combine the advantages of both. Okay. So in terms of business history, which this is an example of, as you'll see, there's a lot of archival detective work. I had to retrace sources and compile sources where sources had been shredded or numbers were not consistent, and put them together into a compelling story. The other thing, of course, another reason why business history is useful is, just as my earlier work on the economic history of illegal paramilitaries suggested, there are some things you just can't do contemporary. I can't go to a cave in Afghanistan with a clipboard and say, excuse me, I'm doing a survey on the organisation of illegal organisations. Would you mind filling it in? That's not going to work. But if I look archivally, I can look at past illegal paramilitaries. And likewise, with commercial confidentiality. I can find lots of things archivally about past businesses that I could never hope to find today in contemporary businesses. And last but not least, there's the question of myth-busting, actually telling the truth. So, that's sort of a general overview. Let's go into the achievements. Now, I'm in no way belittling the achievements. In no way am I sneering. In no way am I trying to be what Americans call a Monday morning quarterback. What I'm trying to suggest here is, here are 4 achievements that we can look at. Okay? So we can see what went well, and then we can look at what didn't go so well, and explain that. There are 4 achievements. The first is that, of course, you create employment in a location, Twinbrook Estate. We don't have official estimates on unemployment in Twinbrook Estate, but we have an unofficial discussion or an unofficial figure of male unemployment in Twinbrook Estate of 80%. Okay, so there's vast unemployment in Twinbrook Estate. Secondly, the achievement is the technical achievement of the state-of-the-art factory itself. You know, it was something that Ford, Mercedes, etc., a whole range of manufacturers said could not be done in that time frame. But as a technical exercise, they moved from cow pasture to production within 18 months. A third was, despite what John Delorean later claimed about absenteeism, absenteeism by 1970s British industrial standards was incredibly low. It was only 1.2%. And last and not least, perhaps most importantly, is the actual iconic product itself, the Delorean itself. So there are very great achievements. So nothing I'm saying is in any way taking away from those achievements. What I'm trying to get away from is a simple explanation that's too good to be true. And a lot of the explanations about Delorean are simply too good to be true, or simply have no supporting evidence. That's the problem. We have this discussion about Delorean as some sort of, as it says in some of these journalistic accounts, a narcissistic personality, exaggerated sense of entitlement, etc., etc., etc. We have discussions of hubris, arrogance, etc. Now, I'm not painting a picture of John Delorean as some latter-day Mary Poppins type figure. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's very clear he was an incredibly complicated human being. Every time I think I understand him in the archive, there's always a curveball that I don't understand. In one of my papers in the journal Business History, I actually talk about Jekyll and Hyde. And if you remember the original novella of Jekyll and Hyde, the essence of the original novella was that Dr. Jekyll initially had control of when he turned into Mr. Hyde or not. But in the novella, he ceased to have control over that transformation. So there are moments at which Delorean does things that are incredibly impressive, like he gets 52 patents. Okay? There are countries in the world I could name that do not have 52 patents. Okay? So his technical achievements are there. Okay? But there are other times when there's things happening that simply aren't so nice or aren't so impressive. I think the key I realised doing more and more research was in one of the better documentaries about John Delorean. It's called Car Crash. It was done by BBC Northern Ireland about 10 years ago. Jim Pryor was interviewed. And Jim Pryor basically sort of said he was just sort of slippery, and he sort of used an analogy of, not deliberately, he was using the analogy as if he was negotiating, playing a game of chess. I think this is a wrong analogy. Okay? When you were negotiating with John Delorean, you were not simply playing somebody who was trying to beat you at chess. You were trying to play against somebody who not only was trying to beat you at chess, they were trying to rewrite the rules of chess as they went along in order that the game could not possibly go any other way than their victory. So when we're talking about the bargaining of the game theory aspect, my economic colleagues would recognise, this is what makes it incredibly complicated, because we're not talking about somebody who's simply playing within the accepted rules of the game. We're talking about somebody who's trying to beat you and trying to rewrite the rules of the game as they go along. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff in 40 minutes I won't discuss, and two of the things I don't discuss, one is the whole cocaine business. I didn't talk about it last night because there was a family audience, and I'm not talking about it today, for I think that distracts us from the actual business model. I can talk about questions and answers. The other thing I'm not going to talk about is the GPD scandal. If you want to find out the GPD scandal, the Northern Ireland Audit Office did a fantastic report in 2004 on the recovery of funds. Sufficient to say that the High Court judge at the Bushell trial, where Bushell ended up doing 3 years behind bars, said that if Delorean had been extradited, he would have done 10 years behind bars. Begs the historical question why he was not extradited. We can speculate on that. Okay, so this is where we look at a bit of empirics. Okay? Economic historian like myself. This is taken from a document in December 1981. As I said, a lot of what I was sending in before I began. One of the things interesting about Delorean, because of the shredding that went on, is But we ended up with a business that was very recent, with incredibly little empirical evidence left. But we ended up with some left. And what's also quite interesting is the numbers that we were left with are not necessarily the numbers the workforce who worked at Delorean would have been aware existed. So very clearly, there was an elite discussion that went on between the hierarchy of the firm and the civil service in London and in Belfast, and that those messages were not relayed to the workers on the factory floor. So when we look at these figures, for instance, by November 1981, just over 6,000 cars had been produced. That's the actual figure. The plan, if it had been implemented, according to what McKinsey's, etc., were suggesting, is production would have been closer to 12,000. Okay? And I don't think that message has percolated through a lot of the literature. Also, what I want to say is the explanation I'm going to come up with is supply side dominated. There is a role for demand in the store, and I can talk about question and answer, but there's far more evidence of supply side problems than demand side problems. A lot of the demand side problems there's either no evidence for or can be explained away. Again, we have to look at the evidence. Okay, so that's the first thing. So bear in mind there's supply side problems here in the business. Apologies for those who saw me last night, but this slide appears again. And this is where we talk about what I mentioned earlier on, I described as our Columbo moment. Remember, I talked about the Columbo moment. This is, I assembled from a range of official sources, is the actual number of workers that were actually employed in Dunmurry during the duration of the plant against the projected number of workers. Okay? So these numbers are based largely on either directly the source of the payroll, etc., of the firm itself, or numbers provided to McKinsey's, who were monitoring the entire plant the entire time, or British government, or Northern Irish Development Agency figures. Now, what's the really interesting thing here? Remember, only about 3,000 Delorean cars were sold during the lifetime of the firm itself, regardless of production. Okay? We don't have a definite number of production of cars. Anybody tells you otherwise, no, we don't. And we don't have exact numbers of sales either. But we can have a rough guess on like 3,000. What's interesting is from the whole of 1979 right into early 1980, because of delays in production, okay, we have people not being hired relative to what was projected. Then we have a situation during 1980 where the number of people projected far exceed the number of employed. And then, of course, remember, the commercial performance of the firm is getting worse all the time, okay? So if commercial performance is getting worse all the time, you would expect the number of employees getting hired to go down, not up. That's busy economics. But that's not what's happening. This is our Columbo moment. We get to late 81, and we get the actual number, about 1,600 against, should have been 1,800. And then suddenly, in the first quarter of 82, we have an incredible upward spike of employment. So, you know, something in these numbers are credible. The key, therefore, is what's happening. Why are more people getting hired than the target? And we're going to come back to that point later on. And it comes back to the point about job creation. It comes back to the point about hiring targets. Now, Nick Sutton, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, in his largely defensive account, I thought, suggests that the hiring targets were exceeded without commercial justification or need. Again, he didn't use the original archival sources, refer to them. Had he done so, I think what was occurring would have been much clearer. Okay, so this is an archival source taken from 1976. This is from the Foreign Office, the Republic of Ireland Department of the Foreign Office, to be precise, in 1976. Because what's clear when you look across the National Archive in London, that this is and PRONI here, Belfast, is when we look across the material 71 to 76, that's what's crucial. For those who can't see at the back, this is a document that says there's an economic dimension to the Northern Ireland problem. If we could flood the north with enough factories and jobs to go around, both sections, blah, 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 tension would be greatly reduced. It goes on. It goes on. I use the Foreign Office document because it's quite interesting. That document essentially makes a very controversial claim that the failure of political progress in Northern Ireland is because too much money has been thrown at Northern Ireland. And the solution would be to withdraw the money. Now that was a minority view that was not implemented. But it's an interesting counterpoint to what actually did occur. And this is where the 71-76 is vital, because without this, there would have been no John Delorean. Okay, so, oops, we got this. Yeah. Okay, so there's a range of official reports written. We know the story about violence, etc. What's less well known is how the institutional framework, the rules of the game changed. So in 1970, we still had the development programme. And that development programme was implemented and was going okay until what clearly happened was the targets were completely distorted by the violence that erupts after the introduction of internment in August 71. At which point the British Treasury, it was nominally the government of Northern Ireland, but in actual fact it was the Treasury. Go to the Treasury files, you can see the Treasury do all the job. They get a very eminent economist called Alec Cairncross, who was Professor of Economics at Glasgow, to do a report very quickly between August and December 71. And the Cairncross report, it's only 17 pages long, but it's one of the best pieces of analysis of the Northern Ireland economy you're ever going to come across. He basically identified the role of the economics in the situation. He basically said in the analysis, you had, and this is where I'm afraid I have to use a technical economic term, a cumulative causation problem. Okay, let me explain that. A cumulative causation problem is where what Cairncross said was as follows. He said, unemployment led to alienation, discontent, and violence. And that violence destroyed investment. And what did destruction of investment do? Increased unemployment. What did increased unemployment do? Increased alienation and violence. What did that do? Decreased investment. In other words, he was talking about a downward spiral in which if you did not put right the unemployment problem, you would have ever more violence, ever reduced investment, and a collapse both economically and politically of Northern Ireland. Now, Cairncross's solution, and I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of Cairncross about the problems he had with trade unions and business leaders in Northern Ireland. That's another story. He said what you needed to do was create the Northern Ireland Finance Corporation with, at 1971 prices, £50 million. That number is important, £50 million is important. Remember, Delorean's original tranche of money in 78 is £53 million. Okay, I know there's inflation between 71 and 78, but bear that in mind. This was a fund for all the manufacturing industries in Northern Ireland. £50 million. So the tranche of money that up front that Delorean got was bigger than the whole pie in 1971. So let's reflect on that. Let's also reflect on the fact that Margaret Thatcher gave a further £30-odd million and actually gave far more than he was entitled to. Okay, so we should also reflect on that. So why talk about 70-71? Because what happens is it's only because of this Finance Corporation that Northern Ireland's Delorean comes. There was an idea of what's called the flying swan. Okay? The flying swan is a very popular idea in development economics. Imagine swans flying in formation, or geese. Doesn't matter what bird you're thinking about, they fly in a V formation. So you have the one bird at the front, the others in the V. And the idea was create a super duper attractive business at the front of the formation, and all others will follow, the economy will thrive. That was an idea. I mean, that's a very noble idea. It's an idea I see in World Bank documents today. It's not a wacky idea by any stretch of imagination. What was interesting was, and I won't go into all the details, I can do it in question and answer, is the evidence led to a bunch of businesses that the Treasury hated that were dreadful. You know, they were created for job creation, but their actual commercial performance was dreadful. And there's a lovely phrase that Stuart Eviard in his PhD thesis found, where one Treasury official described them as soup kitchens disguised as factories. And I think that's only a little bit of hyperbole. There were some truly awful businesses when you look at the numbers. Also, what's clear, and it's part of the story about Delorean, is the level of bureaucratic infighting. For instance, the Northern Ireland Finance Corporation, set up in 1971, £50 million, it was dissolved after the Ulster Workers' Strike in 74 because there was a huge amount of infighting about where money should go. And so they reorganised the Northern Ireland Finance Corporation. And in 1976, remember, when the UK is at the IMF, Northern Ireland is exempt from the IMF conditions. The British decide that the industrial policy in Northern Ireland has become more expensive. And indeed, in 1977, there's going to be £1 billion package. £1 billion package. Remember, 1971, £50 million, 1977, £1 billion. Okay? So, again, going through, I won't go through all the ins and outs of it. We have good private sector reasons why Delorean didn't get money. This, for those who don't know, is the Bricklin SV. It was a gull-wing car created in the early mid-70s in Canada. It was an undercapitalised firm producing a gull-wing car that gobbled up a huge amount of taxpayers' money. Any resemblance to anything else, purely coincidental, as they say at the end credits of TV shows. So you can see why Delorean was finding it very difficult to find private sector finance. Also, Allstate, who now are, of course, quite nearby, major employer in Northern Ireland, they thought about being involved in Delorean because it's a safety car, supposedly. Go onto YouTube, look at the video of the safety tests that didn't go so well and why Allstate pulled out. This is all in public domain. I'll not go through all this stuff like this. I'll get on to the contract. Okay, so what's key, and again we can talk about the file, is George Quigley. If anybody, it's George Quigley, rather than Roy Mason, who really is key to Delorean coming to Northern Ireland. You can actually see in the documents, when Roy Mason's actually making the arguments with the Treasury, he's quoting verbatim Quigley's documents. So Roy Mason had a huge incentive to talk about his role. I think if you go through the archive at all diligently, you see actually it was Quigley was far more implicated, if that's the right word, than Mason. And you should read the document where he talks about how great the management team are. It's gushing, absolutely gushing. Star quality is the phrase he uses. It goes on in that light. Now, bureaucratic infighting is very crucial to the story. Within Whitehall, we have the so you think of it as a spectrum. Within Whitehall, there's the Treasury that thinks Delorean is a really dumb idea. There's the Department of Industry that is kind of agnostic. And there's the Northern Ireland office that thinks it's a great idea. In Northern Ireland Civil Service, they all think it's a great idea. So there's different bureaucratic interests. And one thing that's most revealing in terms of files is there's an entire file of press cuttings from the period where the officials had obviously been monitoring Delorean's commercial record. So it wasn't as if they were unaware of some of his, shall we say, interesting lifestyle choices and some of his interesting business choices. So there was a well-awareness of the risk. The McKinsey reports talk about this as well. I don't have time, because of the archives, etc., to talk about why not Puerto Rico and why not the Republic of Ireland. We can talk about question and answer. We'll talk about the contracts later on. But this is the key, okay? We talked about that Colombo moment, okay? This is the bit, remember we said earlier on about the job creation? This is the key. There are four, I said three there, arguably four, okay? So there's three and arguably four design problems, not in the car, but in the contract. And these four contractual problems, I think, really make this very difficult to get this successful, this project. The first is the additional monies provision. Okay, so remember, the contractor, the negotiation happens very quickly. It happens from 46 days between Delorean's original contact to final sign of contract. It's incredibly rapid. Remember, in 1978, this was a period of high inflation, high interest rates, exchange rate instability. If you were creating an export-oriented business, you wanted guarantees on your price. So, the original idea in the contract was that if some exchange rate fluctuations occurred, or interest rates fluctuations occurred, Delorean would get additional compensation on top of the original 53 million tranche, okay? That was the intention. But the actual drafting of the contract is incredibly vague. It's ridiculous. It basically says, in the event of any unforeseen circumstances, you can get additional monies. Now, in 1970 at Belfast, there were nothing but unforeseen circumstances on the horizon. Okay, so that's the first schoolboy error. Okay, the second is that as an economist, okay, and the Treasury knew this, one of the first things you're trained about is about efficiency. Efficiency is the relationship between inputs and outputs. In other words, how much milk, how much sugar, how much cocoa goes into making a chocolate bar. So it's a relationship between your inputs and your outputs. That's how you measure efficiency. The more output you can make from a given input, the more efficient you are. So efficient businesses are those who have few inputs, produce a lot of outputs. Now, we nowadays, nobody would sign contracts that were not efficiency based. This contract, on the other hand, this master agreement, was employment based. It was purely input based. It was all about job creation. And so Delorean was given until the 5th year, notice that, 5th year of production. Within 5 years of production, to have 2,000 workers. Delorean actually had 2,000 workers within a year of starting production. That's why I said the Colombo moment. Warning bells of any economist should ring at seeing that table. Okay? If the warning bells didn't ring, they would take away my union card as an economist and throw me into the history department. Okay. So, what does it actually say in the contract? It says, any breach by the company of its employment obligations would entitle the Department of Commerce to require Delorean Motor Cars Limited to repay all its financial assistance. In other words, there's a stopwatch. You have 5 years to hire 2,000 people. You don't hire 2,000 people in 5 years. You pay all the money back. Oh dear. Okay. So what do you think the incentives are there? Hire people, regardless of whether you need them or not. The third flaw is the skin in the game problem. Economists call it a skin in the game problem. Skin in the game problem is if you want somebody to behave in a contract, you make sure they have some financial incentive that they're tied in to the deal. Okay? One of the things that's quite clear is they didn't ask for any money from Delorean in the deal. Okay? And Delorean was always very reluctant to put up money himself. In contrast, Puerto Rico would not have given any subsidy to him until he had invested $25 million, either himself or somebody else. So leaving aside the fact that Puerto Rico's package was half that of the UK's package, and leaving aside the ideas package was a third of the UK's package, even all things remaining equal, he was getting money with less strings attached. That's the third flaw. And so by 1982, when we look at the share capital, so Delorean and directors, etc., have about $500,000 of private money in, with 73% of the shares. The Great British taxpayer, with 17.7 million, has the remaining ordinary shares. There's some imbalance, therefore, again, of risk and reward. Okay? That's leaving aside all talk about royalty payments and that kind of stuff. But this, far more importantly than all that, is this last collateral problem. It's a catch-22 problem. Within the contract, all the assets were government property until the product was launched. Well, you might say that's not unreasonable. But if you also want the firm to get private capital, the firm has got to have collateral. But what collateral do you have when you don't have any collateral that you own until the product is launched? Think about it. So what happens, therefore, is Delorean then comes again and says he'd like £14 million loan because he can't get any private finance. The lawyers look into it and say, yeah, he's got a point, give him £14 million. In fact, McKinsey said he needed closer to £22 million, but don't tell him. What happens, of course, they give the loan, and then he comes back again, and he threatens legal action and says, I want legally this to be turned into a grant, not a loan. And that's something that's very clear. Delorean was very keen always to threaten litigation, and the British were very reluctant. And you should think about that incentive issue closely. So what happens by July 1980, very early on, even Sutton in his account says there was a tipping of the scales. In fact, as early as June 1980, I've seen a Treasury official saying it's time to pull the plug. Remember, production doesn't start till February 81. So we could have had production stopped before it began. Okay, but why is that? Because Economics 101 tells you about sunk costs. Okay? Sunk cost is this. The costs you've already incurred are not relevant to your future returns. In other words, if you start reading Katie Hopkins' biography, let's say, 200-page book, God forbid, and you're 100 pages in, and you realise this is dreadful, economics tells you, stop. Don't go try and finish the book if it's dreadful. Stop. The 100 pages you've already read are not worth trying to get 100 more. So the Treasury officials, good economists, said there's £24 million sunk cost in physical capital here. You really won't recover it. And of course, when the firm goes under, the capital gets auctioned off. Again, we don't have, as far as I know, any good source on what price is actually found for that physical capital. I would love to know. So, again, I could talk a bit more of the Thatcher government and extra subsidies. I'm not going into too much detail. There's a letter from Humphrey Atkins to Keith Joseph about the religious aspect. What I want to do is move to just towards the ending. These symptoms, okay? Some of these symptoms, and then round up. So just this one. Yeah. Okay, so what we have are recurrent appeals for cash under the Thatcher government. Okay, and Jim Pryor, as late December 1981, is still favouring keeping the money in. He's actually minded to let Delorean produce a sedan, which Department of Industry, by that stage, have already said, are you mad? The Treasury, of course, say it should be closed immediately. Department of Industry, that had been agnostic, are now saying, really, a second product? He hasn't made the first product work yet. Wait till the first product works, then maybe a second product. Jim Pryor's already said, no, let him have a second product, a sedan. There's all these bank guarantees, and there's the riot damage compensation. That riot damage compensation is way in excess of any damage that was incurred. And again, this was a soft way of giving extra money to the firm. I could talk about, the gold taps, all that kind of stuff. Why that matters is not simply because it's interesting, but it's because it tells us about what was out of kilter in terms of the composition of the costs. Legal budget exceeded the advertising budget. I don't know of any other car company in history where that was the case. And think about the incentives again. Let's go back to that. Why were the British so reluctant to sue Delorean even when he breached contract, like the Transbus? Why? Because they didn't want a nasty image out there. Delorean, however, had no compunction whatsoever of threatening legal action, even when you look through the files, and there's no legal basis for his claims. So, who really had the incentive here to keep the firm going? I leave it to you to judge. So what happens is, basically, he miscalculates. I think the final straw is when the British government and I think Jim Pryor get wind that Delorean is going around telling people in New York he has the British over a barrel and they're going to keep pouring money in. And the British also are freaking out because he's going around claiming that there were 148 bomb attacks on the factory, for instance. This is, of course, absolute tissue of nonsense. So there's all these stories floating around that Delorean's portraying. Now remember I talked about the flying swan. In other words, you have the first firm at the front that has the high super image that attracts the following geese, birds, whatever after him. What you're actually doing by allowing Delorean to spin this yarn is that front bird is actually really unattractive, and it's acting as a disincentive for further investment. At that point, what we see in the files is really revealing, and not necessarily one of these ones, but there is a file I've seen, where civil servants in Northern Ireland actually draft a point-by-point rebuttal of every claim that John Delorean is making about the factory and terrorism. Now, I haven't seen any evidence that that briefing was ever put into a press release or a newspaper article, but the fact that civil servants drafted it is very revealing. It suggests that they were well aware the game was out of control. And of course, as job creation became less and less secure, the Treasury had its arms strengthened. And it said, enough is enough. You've had your fun. Let's put the money into something else. So it wasn't ideology. It was the Treasury and John Delorean miscalculating. So what I want to conclude by saying, in a rationality type story, it was a story in which Delorean finally miscalculated, as he did with the IDA in Dublin. He thought he could strong-arm O'Malley. He thought he could strong-arm the IDA. He didn't realise the IDA was independent. He thought, as I said earlier on, they could change the rules of the game, but he couldn't. And he ran out of road. And he tried to change the rules of the game enough in Northern Ireland, but eventually, even Jim Pryor, who had been his biggest fan, said enough is enough. Now, I could talk about all the Delorean after Delorean stuff. Suffice to say, the actual supposed, due diligence was supposed to be £80,000 of public money. Not surprising, having put £83 million of public money in, the idea that this was a new, fresh firm didn't impress Kenneth Cork or anybody else for that matter, and the firm collapsed. But it left us with a beautiful product that we shouldn't take away, and its achievements. And thank you for your forbearance. That's the end of the show. Now I can take a few questions.